maybe what I could have done better or things I left out, stuff like that. So should probably do this more often. Okay, so if you notice the title here, it says Drifting Toward Disunion, 1854 to 1861. Although actually some of the things in here are going to be before 1854, but so we're dealing with like key events that's going to cause a nation to split. Now we've already been talking about that with the Fugitive Slave Law and all those things. There's some more key events coming up, okay? And maybe in some respects, the Civil War actually starts in this lecture when they talk about Kansas. So I'll get into Bleeding Kansas here in a moment. But I want to start with a book, okay? I'll start with this book. Got my copy right here. You can see it's pretty thick, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin, okay? There are some very significant books in not only American history, but of course, world history. And what makes a book incredibly significant in history? It has impact, okay? And Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think it's hard to argue that there's a book in American history that's been more important than Uncle Tom's Cabin because of the impact that it had upon the United States. Now, in many respects, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a response to the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is released in 1852. Remember, and you should know this, but the Fugitive Slave Act had some conditions that people were upset about. All runaway slaves had to be returned. It became illegal to aid runaway slaves in their escape. It became illegal not to help find them if you knew where they were at. You had to contribute to it. You could face jail time or fines if you didn't. And then there were magistrates who were appointed strictly for this purpose to adjudicate accused runaway slaves, and they got paid more if they returned the slaves. So that's arguably corrupt. So one of the people really upset about all those provisions is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she is from a family of longtime abolitionists, a family of preachers. Her dad, Lyman Beecher, was a preacher. I think her brother was a preacher too, Henry Ward Beecher. And they are staunch abolitionists. And she writes this book, and she's a very good writer. Not going to be the only book she writes, but she writes this book in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, and she wants to use this book to identify the horrors of slavery, which by now we're well aware of as part of this course. And the main character in it, Uncle Tom, is a loyal slave who was eventually whipped to death by his owner. Sorry if I'm giving away the ending there, but kind of need to know that. And so really like I used to have my college students read this book, and they had to determine kind of the central meaning of it, or maybe the thesis or theme of it. And basically the message of the book is that even the best slave, Uncle Tom was an incredibly loyal slave to his master. It was the Shelbys. I'm forgetting the master's first name, but incredibly loyal. Like his master would trust him to go to Cincinnati with hundreds of dollars or pick up hundreds of dollars from Cincinnati and return. And Uncle Tom would do it. He could have maybe taken off and gone to Canada, but he was loyal to his master. His master treated him well as you could treat a slave, gave him a lot of independence and trusted Tom with a lot of things. Well, what happens? His master incurs a massive amount of debt, and he has to sell Tom to cover his debts. And so what is the message? That even the most loyal, dependable slave in the most paternalistic, I hate using that word with slavery. What is paternalistic about enslaving someone and treating them like an object? But even the most paternalistic master with the most loyal slaves who supposedly they have a friendship, right? And maybe even a caring for each other, even in those situations, that person's life was completely subject to no control over his destiny, and he could be subject to the abuses of slavery, because Tom will be sold down the river, and will be sold to a much crueler master by the name of Simon Legree, right, to the deeper south, and Simon Legree will whip him to death. It's really a shame. I don't know what you know about African American culture and language, but it's really a shame that Uncle Tom, and this is my opinion, of course, But it's really a shame that Uncle Tom has come to mean in Black culture like an African American who just does whatever whites want him to do and doesn't stand up to whites or anything like that. Um, because Uncle Tom in the end is killed for standing up to his master. That's why he's killed. So I think it's unfortunately that's become somewhat of a derogatory term in Black culture. So this becomes a best-selling book in the U.S. and the world. Sells millions of copies. Also became a very popular play, and it's even been made into a movie a few times. And I'm going to show you a clip here from a 1988 version of it. Okay, so this is from 1988. So you'll notice Tom getting whipped here, but it's not going to be as gory as it might be in a movie theater, or maybe as realistic, because these whips, as you've seen in some photos, could make some very egregious scars. You're not going to see that in a 1988 made-for-TV film. But let me just show you. So I'm going to show you part of this clip here. A movie called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Right? It's a little blurry. Hopefully you can hear it okay. This is Simon Legree.
Well, now, here he is. Good morning to you, Tom. You have a good sleep? Or like me, were you worrying about them two gals? I have made up my mind that I'm going to kill you. Listen, you tell me what's happened to them. Now, maybe you don't believe me. Maybe you think that your master wouldn't throw away that kind of money. But I assure you, boy, I am sincere. Sincere. So, you hear me? So now you speak up. Come on, speak up, huh? Nothing to tell. Boy, I have counted the cost. And I am determined to break you once and for all right now. I am going to take every drop of blood you got. I ask you, do you hear me? Well, you take my blood. That is nothing. No. You can hurt me no more. Master, you never go. You don't used to go on. Yep. I do believe he's done for you. Yeah. At least he's stopped his mouth from preaching, and that is a comfort. Whoa. I think we done a wicked thing, because I ain't never felt like this before. Oh, we done near killed it. He breathing. Oh, Lord Jesus, forgive me. Hang down.
Okay, I know you'd probably like to watch the rest of that, but I've got other things I want to tell you today. Sorry. But you may notice the imagery there. What Harriet Beecher does is Tom is kind of, he's the Christ figure in the book, right? She's a very religious person, very religious family. So there's a lot of Christian symbolism in the film. He gives his life, Tom does, so that 2 other female slaves would escape. He would not reveal to his master, Simon Legree, where they were. And he knew where they were at that moment in time, so he wouldn't give them up. And once again, it kind of bothers me that the Uncle Tom, that's become seen as, once again, the black person, the African American person who just does what Whitey wants him to do, right? Because Tom doesn't do that in the end. He really stands up to this cruel master, which allows the escape of 2 other slaves. And really, it's Sambo and Jimbo in here who are doing whatever the master wants them to do by beating Tom to death. He's not dead yet in this, but he does pass away. Okay, and so it's a tragedy, right? There is, I guess, some happy ending in the slaves that escape, but not a happy ending for the main character. So what is the significance of this book? Continue to anger people in the North. Once again, it's a reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act. It also angered people in the South who argued that it misrepresented slavery, we're paternalistic and all this stuff. But Harriet Beecher defended her research for this. And indeed, when we do research slavery, we find that this is actually pretty accurate. Simon Legree even mentions that it doesn't make sense, that maybe you think I won't kill you because you're too expensive, but I've decided that's what I'm going to do if necessary. So there's those references there, which indicate a little bit of the accuracy. So just a couple of things here, and maybe I'm going on about this book too much, but I'm just trying to indicate to you the significance of this book. Once again, it sold millions around the world. It was published in several languages. Lincoln actually met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862. And he said, "You're the little lady who started this war," which is maybe an exaggeration of the effect, but interesting comment. He might have been joking there. Lincoln liked to joke around a lot. It inspired further resistance to the fugitive slave law, which you guys wrote about earlier this week and wrote about very well, by the way. Those were good, guys. Inspired enlistment for the North when war broke out. Now, most Union soldiers who joined to fight on the side of the North probably aren't necessarily getting into it to fight for the abolition of slavery, but some are, and maybe many are. And some of the reasons for that is this book, which they read and inspired them that, I'm going to join because I think slavery should end. And there are soldiers who joined for that reason. Okay. Robert Guild Shaw is maybe one of the most famous of those, which you'll learn about later. And then the other thing is this: when the South secedes, remember, they secede and they believe they can separate from the North because of King Cotton, right? We've got the economy, we'll be fine. Cotton helps us survive economic downturns and all that stuff. Now, you know that they became dependent upon world markets, but they're also kind of counting on that dependence here because they were hoping that they would get aid from England and France. Remember, France aided us in our own revolution. The South is kind of thinking, well, we can survive this thing. We can secede if England supports us. And the English elite was probably ready to do so. The French elite was probably ready to do so due to the cotton and the aristocracy of the South. But the common people in Britain and France would not support this. They became vehemently against that in many respects because of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it's hard to underplay the significance of this book. And it is a pretty good read. It's older language. I was reading a little bit of it last night and even just a wee bit today, thinking about this lecture. It's not like you could kick back and read this, but it's thick. It takes a while, but it's a novel, right? It's not a bad read. And so you can imagine the success of the time period, very readable book. Now, there are some other books read that have maybe a different kind of impact, and I thought I'd mention another one. There's a book written in 1857 called The Impending Crisis of the South. Interesting title, right? Kind of predicting that a crisis is coming. And this is a book written by Hittner Helper. And what he wrote, basically his thesis is that non-slaveholding whites were hurt the most by slavery. Now, I think on the surface, that's a pretty weak thesis because I would argue that those who are enslaved are hurt the most by slavery. But he does have a point in that non-slaveholding whites were hurt by slavery because of the monopolization of land that was occurring by Southern planters. Remember that. And the fact that they're relying on enslaved labor instead of employing free laborers and paying them. That's not a bad argument. But this book will be banned in the South. Well, actually, it is a bad argument because he's dismissing the plight of the slaves here. But arguing that non-slaveholding whites are hurt by slavery is not a bad argument. That's a pretty accurate argument. And obviously, Uncle Tom's Cabin will be banned in the South, too. Abolitionist writings, period, are banned in the South. Okay, another event to mention. Kind of an awkward transition going from a book to this, but I'm just mentioning events leading right into war, is an event known as Bleeding Kansas. So remember, Kansas and Nebraska were territories carved out of the unorganized territory that existed. It had been determined, and that happened in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it had been determined that those territories would have slavery determined, I'm using that word too much, but that whether or not those territories would have slaves would be based on popular sovereignty. So what you're going to have is groups advocate settlement in these territories who favor one or the other. So if you look at this first bullet here, supporters and opponents of slavery converged in Kansas. So you've got groups saying, hey, if you want more opportunity, you want to get out of, I don't know, New York City or whatever, go to Kansas, support abolition, or go to South New York City wouldn't work, but if you want to get out of Georgia or wherever, go to Kansas, right? Support slavery, bring slavery there. And so what we see with Kansas, and I think this is why popular sovereignty didn't work, is we see the worst possible workings of popular sovereignty. Anti-slavery advocates are funding and encouraging the settlement of abolitionists there. One of those is the New England Immigrant Aid Company, and this is all in chapter 14 if you haven't read it yet. Now this is angering Southerners. So the fact that you have these groups like the New England Immigrant Aid Company, who was actually encouraging a lot of new immigrants coming to the United States to settle there, as long as they're abolitionists. So the fact that you have these groups who are settling abolitionist settlers in this territory is really upsetting the South, because the South was expecting Kansas to be a slave state and maybe willing to let Nebraska be free. So kind of like when one enters that's free, another should enter that's enslaved, and the South feels like, hey, they're trying to make both these territories or both these eventual states free here, right? So that angers them. So what they have is people in Missouri are encouraged to go to the South and illegally vote in elections. And these are called border ruffians. That's probably what the abolitionists are calling them, from Missouri. And they're going to vote in 1855 to elect members of the first territorial legislature. So they're trying to create a territorial legislature, right, to create laws, create a constitution, all those things. And what happens is these border ruffians come over from Missouri that shouldn't even be voting in Kansas at all. And they're voting in large numbers, and they're voting early and often. Okay, there are certain forces in our politics these days that claim that, this last election was not legit. Most evidence indicates that that's not true. In this time period, there was actually, in places like Kansas, a lot of illegal voting going on, and particularly by by these people from Missouri. What they do is they set up a government in Shawnee Mission, Kansas, and the Free Soilers set up a government and established their own legislature in Topeka, Kansas. So we've got these two competing governments being formed in Kansas, one pro-slavery, one pro-abolition. Eventually, there's going to be bloodshed. And where is that bloodshed going to occur? Well, first of all, the first map is just reminding you where Kansas is. The South was expecting any states carved out of this territory to be pro-slavery, and then maybe expecting these to be free. The abolitionists are trying to make all of this free, and they believe it should be because they still think, they're still upset that the Missouri Compromise line was repealed. Remember that. Okay, so where does bloodshed take place between these two forces in Kansas? It can be argued that the Civil War came to Kansas first, because we see some bloodshed occurring already. This map is pretty good. It shows 3 battles here: Lawrence, Osawatomie, All these are happening in 1856. And then Potawatomi, the Potawatomi Massacre, which happens on May 24th to 25th, 1856. The two I want to focus upon is Lawrence and Potawatomi. Once again, Josh is probably reading a lot about this because it involves John Brown, and he may know more about this than me right now because he's freshly researching it. But in Lawrence, a gang of pro-slavery raiders burnt part of the Free Soil town. They burned it to the ground, destroyed some buildings. I don't believe they killed anybody in Lawrence, if I'm remembering correctly, but there was a lot of property damage done. They tried to destroy the town. That makes this guy pretty mad. This guy is John Brown, who has recently arrived in Kansas himself. And he is going to carry out the Potawatomi Creek Massacre in 1856. Now, a little bit about John Brown, a little bit of background about him. John Brown is a diehard abolitionist, obsessively so. He believes slavery is one of the worst evils, if not the worst evil, that can be perpetrated upon someone outside of killing them. He had spent time in Ohio, which I think is interesting. He was not a good businessman. He fails at several businesses at this point, but one thing he is not failing at is abolition. As a matter of fact, at this point, he had escorted some slaves to the freedom of Canada, which he called one of the, if not the greatest moment of his life, when he escorted people to freedom. He's angry about Lawrence, Kansas. He and others, probably some of his sons, he had several sons, a very large family. I'm forgetting the numbers right now. I want to say he had 20 sons. John Brown and others abducted, that's right, 20 sons. John Brown and others abducted 5 pro-slavery supporters and murdered them. Basically, he literally hacked to death 5 hacked with like swords or swords, I think. 5 presumed pro-slavery men in front of their families. So very violent. Now, the thing is, we know that the people he killed didn't have anything to do with Lawrence, Kansas, or at least that's what your textbook says, but they were believed to be pro-slavery men, and for John Brown, that was enough. John Brown, by 1856, has come to the conclusion that the only way to end slavery is through blood, that the approaches of people like William Lloyd Garrison, who you may remember, does not advocate violence. He says those aren't dramatic enough. The only way to end this scourge of humanity is to wage war against it. So once again, in some respects, the Civil War had already started in Kansas. Let me mention the Lecompton Constitution and then one more event, and then I'll probably be done for today. Okay, guys? The Lecompton Constitution is passed in 1857. Now, this is an attempt at forming a constitutional government in Kansas, okay? Now, the Lecompton Constitution is dubious in that it is no way not going to allow the existence of slavery in Kansas, okay? By 1857, Kansas has enough people to apply for statehood. And what's happened with the Lecompton Constitution is the pro-slavery forces had devised a constitution that no matter how you approved it, there were going to be slaves there. The people could vote on it, but they could vote for it with or without slavery. So you go to vote for the Lecompton Constitution, you say, I think this Constitution is okay, but no slavery. I think it's okay, but slavery. The problem is, if you voted against slavery, there was a remaining provision in it that protected the owners of slaves already in Kansas. So this upset abolitionists who felt that Kansas should be a free state. So once again, you could vote no slavery, but if the people already had slaves there, they could keep those slaves. So whatever the outcome, there would still be slavery in Kansas. Most of the free soilers decide to not even vote. They boycotted the polls because they felt like they couldn't vote for this because it allowed for slavery no matter what, and they were opposed to that. So the pro-slavery people, the pro-slavery ites, they're sometimes called, voted the Constitution through. President Buchanan, who's president who gets elected president in 1856, so he's president in 1857, President Buchanan supported it, but Congress did not, okay? And actually, Stephen Douglas didn't support it. So think about what was mentioned the other day, that actually Stephen Douglas is not necessarily pro-slavery, he's just pro-popular sovereignty, which in the eyes of abolitionists makes him pro-slavery, but he didn't support the Lecompton Constitution because he didn't believe that was allowing for popular sovereignty, that the people should have a choice, slavery or no. And the Lecompton Constitution wasn't allowing that. And by the way, that's probably going to cost him the presidency, because that's going to cause the South to turn against him. So that's a little interesting tidbit about Stephen Douglas. Let's see. Congress, Stephen Douglas came out against it. Congress then stated there had to be a revote for the entire Constitution, slavery or no. The Free Soilers then voted in large numbers and voted down the Constitution in 1857. So the Constitution passed, allowing slaves that were already there. 1857, the Free Soilers voted it down. Kansas remained a territory until secession in 1861. Okay. And then secession will occur. All right, one more thing to mention because it's kind of related. In the midst of bleeding Kansas, there was a fight on the floor of the Senate. A man by the name of Charles Sumner is beaten within an inch of his life. He's caned by Preston Brooks, who is a representative of South Carolina. So he comes over, so he goes into the Senate chamber, right? Charles Sumner had given a speech demonizing slavery, mentioned one of Preston Brooks' relatives in it, but also really attacked South Carolina as kind of what he called the birthplace of slavery. And he did use some pretty disparaging language. Sumner was capable of that. Brooks thought that his honor had been challenged and the honor of his state had been challenged. But he didn't think, now typically in these situations, you would challenge him to a duel, right? Think about what happened to Alexander Hamilton. Andrew Jackson participated in a couple of duels and survived those. Duels are kind of dying out in this period, but they still kind of happen. But Brooks doesn't consider Charles Sumner a gentleman, so he doesn't challenge him to a duel. He decides to walk down in the Senate chamber and beat, there's no way to put it better, he beat the snot out of him with a cane, cracked his skull. Charles Sumner had to spend a year out of office. He couldn't serve for a year. Massachusetts people voted him into office even when he couldn't run, kind of in defiance. And you see in the background here, some of the senators supported this and were laughing about it. Others maybe wanted to get involved, but it's kind of like when you watch a fight, people don't break it up. They just kind of stare at it until the teacher comes along and breaks it up, right? That's what happened here. And people of the South loved it. They sent Preston Brooks hundreds of canes. Way to defend our honor. How gentlemanly. People in the North. So this is what Southern chivalry is, huh? This is how you solve stuff. You beat people to death. Yeah, that's really, how honorable is that? What a great system. So this is another event that is further dividing both sections. Okay. And a little bit related to bleeding Kansas. I wanted to squeeze this in because what was going on in Kansas kind of spurred what Senator Charles Sumner, a diehard abolitionist, an immediate abolitionist from Massachusetts, that event, bleeding Kansas, caused him to give him the speech. Okay. All right, kids, kept you about 3 minutes over, although I'm allowed with you guys. So, right. Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, let me know. And please respond to these lectures at some point. Your outline is due tomorrow. Okay. Have a good day, guys. Hey, we'll keep tomorrow short. Turn in your outline, talk about it briefly, and then I'm going to let you go. Okay. All right. Hey, see ya.